this country threatens another country, we have to take very seriously those threats, because look what has been done in our names just in the last 11 years in that region, beginning with Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and then we have the case of the drone bombing in Pakistan, which is, we know, killing hundreds of people. We call them people. Our government calls them either insurgents or militants, and they justify the killing on the basis of that. But this is going on across the region. And I thought I would just give a little bit of an opening presentation that speaks to why people living in this country should be so firmly opposed against a U.S. or a NATO attack and threats against the region, and specifically Iran, going back 30-some years, and looking at the history of what the United States has done to Iran. I'm sure many of us in this room are familiar with very basic situations that in the 1950s, the elected leader of Iran was overthrown by a CIA coup. This is well known. This is not even a secret that the U.S. makes anymore. This is admitted that this was an intervention because the U.S. wanted to be able to control the oil refining that was centered in Iran. And then we have the Shah of Iran developing an extremely cozy relationship with the United States through President Jimmy Carter. I remember as a student being involved in protests at the White House when the Shah of Iran came to meet with Jimmy Carter. Chummy, chummy, we'll stand behind you forever. You don't have a thing to worry about. But guess what? Then my compatriots, the Iranian students, and the masses in Iran did something that almost nobody expected, that was extraordinary. And that was a rebellion. Millions of people were in the streets, literally. And on one day, over 10,000 people were killed by the Shah's military. This was an extraordinary situation in 1978 and 79. And, you know, we're not here mainly to talk about that, but it is important for people to understand that the U.S. government was 100% against the Iranian people at that point having any self-determination, and still had CIA agents operating within the country even after the new government took over. And this was the basis of the so-called hostage crisis when the student activists took over the U.S. Embassy in 1979 and seized 400-some hostages, which were, they said at the beginning, these were CIA agents, and you had our government saying, oh, you know, who would ever believe such a thing, that this was the CIA? This was, you know, diplomats and people in the embassy. They couldn't have been CIA agents, and yet, this was hilarious, and I remember seeing the photos. The students took the shredded documents and laboriously pasted these documents back together that had been so hastily shredded when the embassy was evacuated, and they proved indeed many of these hostages were CIA agents, and their purpose in being in Iran, of course, was to keep and reestablish U.S. control of Iran. So we know since the beginning of the Khomeini regime back in '79 that this has always been an aim of the U.S. Here they had a very stable ally at one end of the region in Iran, and then they had Israel, right? When they lost Iran, it was a very, very big problem. And we know that because we can read about the morning of 9/11 when Donald Rumsfeld was responding very quickly to what had happened at the World Trade Center. time, to roll through. We're going to roll it all up, all the way to Iran. And they expected, from reading some of these books and a lot of the contemporaneous records that journalists have written over the last 10 years, the Bush administration expected very quickly that they were going to do Afghanistan. They were going to go right through Iraq into Iran, and it was going to be a piece of cake. And they were going to have their control of Iran back again. And this was all under the justification of the so-called global war on terror. It didn't work out that way by any means, for a whole host of reasons. The U.S. found itself in a great trouble beginning in 2001. And we are seeing the results of that, and we're discussing that in other panels this weekend. Including this afternoon, we're going to be talking about Afghanistan. And we have been meeting and working very intensely over the last month to find ways to develop opposition to the U.S. drone war that I mentioned is being carried out now in 6 countries, and is increasingly the way the U.S. is going to be fighting more through unmanned vehicles, popularly referred to as drones. People remember that last fall, a drone was somehow suddenly in Iran, and it was down at the airport, and the Iranians were saying, "Oh, look what we have here. We have a U.S. drone. How did that come to be over Iran?" Well, yes, indeed. How did it become to be in the possession of the Iranian military? Because it was doing surveillance over Iran, as is constantly the case. And the Obama administration had the nerve to say, "You better give us back our drone," which they did not. But we have a situation that right now, I just want to speak briefly to, and I know that Shayda and Ali are going to talk about it. I want people to pay very close attention. The U.S. is not through threatening Iran. There have been some developments in the last few months where it may be that, for the time being, it's difficult to say that the non-existent nuclear weapons program that no one has proven the existence of, shall I say, may or may not be going forward. It's not even clear what the Iranian government is going to do with the nuclear power program at this point. They are being squeezed relentlessly through the so-called humanitarian use of sanctions, which we are told, "Oh, don't worry, we're not going to kill anyone, we're just going to use sanctions." And we know from the history of Iraq, 500,000 people died because of the sanctions that started with the Clinton administration. Madeleine Albright being challenged specifically, back in the 90s, to justify the sanctions that were brought against the people of Iraq. Do you know that children are dying because of these sanctions? And she said, "Well, we think this is worth it. That the death of Iraqi children are worth it for the greater aims of the United States in controlling the region." This is what the threats on Iran are about. What's in the media is that this is about Iran's nuclear program. I do not believe this is the reason. I think it's demonstrably true. The U.S. is still seeking regime change, still wants a pro-U.S. government to be part of its needed influence in the region. And whether it's been the Bush regime, as I refer to it, threatening all through its term, or now the Obama administration using global sanctions and using its ties with NATO and with other friendly former imperialist colonialist powers who have their own designs on Iran and their own experience, that this is still a very dangerous situation, and that it is incumbent on people living in this country, first and foremost, to oppose any intervention, humanitarian, whether it's called humanitarian or if it's just plain old aggressive war, that's our first and foremost responsibility. But I do want to say robust movement that's grown up over and over. It's come back with generations of students opposing the religious, the mullahs and the religious government in Iran. That movement and that work against the internal repression in Iran absolutely must be supported by us as people who care about humanity, and that's extremely controversial, including within the people attending this and the organizations that are sponsoring this event today and the protests against NATO. And you know, we do want to say absolutely key to be opposing any attack on the people of Iran carried out by our government, and that we have the utmost responsibility as well to be supporting our sisters. And I say sisters first because who is targeted most sharply by the Islamic Republic is the women, to support our sisters and brothers in this struggle internal to Iran. We are human beings first. We are people who care about humanity, and that's our responsibility to look at that struggle, not as people who live in this country, but as people who are in solidarity